With Rick Olson. This week, my special guest is Kerrie Zhivago. She's an attorney, family law attorney in Phoenix, and the author of Surviving a Psychopath. Today's podcast is disengaging from a psychopath. Welcome, Kerrie.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's a really important topic.
It really is. And, this is a special kind of an animal, right? I mean, Um, it's insidious, it's crafty, it's manipulative, and it's oftentimes really hard to detect when you are engaged with one. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. I would call them the ice cold strategist, is really what they are. I mean, they're predators in disguise, but what's important here is identifying who they are and building that awareness. Because when you're involved with somebody who you believe has these psychopathic traits, it's really terrifying. I mean, I've called it sort of emotional terrorism when you're embroiled in
Hmm.
that kind of relationship. And the trick is, how do you escape it once you're aware of it? How do you extricate yourself out of it? So
Hmm.
there is an exit strategy as a
Okay.
family law lawyer, so how do you do it? And I think that's really the reason that I wrote the book on surviving it, because the ripple effects of it are so severe. And I'm so passionate about this subject because it really is, it's the wound is the psychological wound. And so the person that's experiencing it is really trying to um, overcome and recover from that psychological wound. And in many cases, it is a crime without a crime scene. And in the most extreme cases, it's really sort of death in slow motion. So that's why I think the subject is really important, and bringing awareness to it is important.
So you're talking about healing from the wound. This is the person that's trying to escape the orbit of the psychopath. Is that correct? Is that what you're saying?
Correct. Yes. Yeah, and I,
What?
and I think that probably the first part of that is being able to identify that you're in that kind of relationship, whether it's I'm a family law lawyer, so we'll just use marriage, or a significant other relationship. But there certainly can run the gamut. It can be an employer-employee relationship. It
Mhm.
can, really, it's very diverse. But since we're in the family law arena, and most of your listeners are from that world,
Mhm.
that's really what I'm talking about, is being able to identify those characteristics. And so I don't ever use the label psychopath because it's limiting. Psychopathy is a spectrum, and
Mhm.
it can take on many forms. But I think the most significant traits that I think your listeners would relate to is a lack of empathy. So they are predators in disguise, and they wear that mask of normalcy. Um, they're masterful at it. And so I tend to not want to label people, but if your listeners are asking, you know, I am I in a relationship with a psychopath, and is a psychopath a narcissist, and what's the difference between a narcissist or a psychopath and a sociopath? Then you get really sort of mishmashed involved with all these labels. And so I like to simplify that and just say that every sociopath and psychopath is a narcissist, but not every narcissist is a sociopath or a psychopath.
Mhm.
And they have many overlapping qualities, which is why I don't like to label them, because you're limiting it. A person who has psychopathic traits is somebody who is typically born that way.
Mhm.
So that's the big difference. A sociopath might be somebody who is influenced by their environment. They've had trauma in their background, or neglect, or abuse, or what have you. And so a lot of times it's environmentally influenced. So those are the real distinctions between the two categories. But if you want to get really clinical, they really fall under the umbrella of antisocial personality
Right.
disorders.
Right. What What brought you to this focus? What was the piece that made you want to have this type of a focus on psychopathy in your books and your practice? What was the base that brought you in here?
Yeah, so good question. So I mean, I have personally experienced it not only in my relationships, my personal relationships, but also as an attorney. I've been on the other side where I've had to litigate against somebody who is dangerous and
Mm-hmm.
has emotionally terrorized a client of mine. And so, because of my personal experiences, I really felt strongly that there wasn't a manual, there wasn't a guide out there that would really help people navigate this kind of abuse. And so, psychological abuse is soul damaging. It can really it cuts to the core of who you are as a person. I mean, you feel like you're living in this crazy making world, and you're sort of losing grip on what's real and what isn't real. And oftentimes you're very isolated, and there really isn't a place to go where people understand that. And so, I've always said that a person who is a survivor of that kind of psychological abuse, they don't need to be rescued. They need to be validated. So, they need to be believed. And so I felt very strongly, because I was seeing it not only in my personal, relationship and what I did to get out of that, but I saw it in the courtroom too. So I saw clients of mine being re-traumatized, re-victimized in the courtroom when they were going up against their predators. They were not believed by the court system, and the court system was very limiting in terms of how they were, helping the survivors of, and that was
Mm-hmm.
very frustrating to me. There was not legislation at the time. There was this paradigm in the court system that was infuriating to me, where the paradigm was, let's reunite the children with the predator. It
Mm-hmm.
wasn't switching that and saying, let's protect them from the predator. And so it really started to, I saw this huge chasm really growing between what judges and attorneys understood versus what the reality was and what
Right.
the survivors needed in order to navigate this. And so I took all of that knowledge and all of that experience, and I decided to write a guide. And it really just started as I thought I would write a pamphlet. That's what I had in mind at first. Like maybe a
Always
brief
starts
little
with a
pamphlet
pamphlet.
that I could hand out to my clients and say, here you go. And it sort of mushroomed into this much larger thing. And I realized, wow, this is something that people need. And there seems to be a vacuum here. There isn't really a way
Right.
to be able to educate a lot of people at once, of this kind of abuse and why it's so important to understand it, why it's so dangerous.
Well, these people are, by definition, masters of manipulation. They're masters of gaslighting, and for professionals, for judges and attorneys, and people don't really understand that functioning. Um, it's reasonable to look back and say, well, how do we determine who's telling the right stuff here? We're in he said, she said territory. And again, these people are just they're masters at gaslighting, and not just that predatory piece of um, the person that they're related to, but everybody around them, with the massive distortions of reality that they put out there as a plausible reason for behavior.
Yeah, and that's really the insidious nature of it, because they are masters at it. So they lack empathy, which means that they don't feel anything, but they can mimic feelings. So
Hmm.
they don't have they can't experience something the way that we might, but they can mimic it. And so that's the fascinating and disturbing nature of the predator. And so they manage to manipulate their own lawyers, they manipulate the judges, they oftentimes will present themselves as the victim in
Right.
this, which is just infuriating and maddening. And
Hmm.
so, really, what has to happen when you're going up against this is you have to have the mindset that you're going into battle, because it is a battle. And you know, psychopaths, they love the game. They're in it for the long game.
Right.
And so
Right.
so I like to sort of make this comparison where they are the chess players, whereas a sociopath is the person that's going to flip the chessboard. So if you look at it from the standpoint of they're the chess players and you're the pawn in their game, you know, it's, you have to steel yourself against that to not be that pawn. And so how do you do that? Well, first and foremost, you have to educate the court system on what's happening here. You have to make them understand that this is a thing, that psychological warfare has now entered into the courtroom arena. And so what they're seeing may not be the truth. And so what I always encourage people to do is you have to be able to correct and or flip the narrative.
Mhm.
So the psychopath and their lawyer, and unfortunately a lot of times their lawyers are duped by this as well, and they're in that very conflicting space of they have to zealously advocate for their client, but at the same time, they may not actually be informed of what is actually the truth. So it's a very interesting dynamic there, and difficult to navigate. But if you're on the other side of that, it's really imperative that you correct the record, because they are going to basically bomb the court with motions and, you know, rewrite their own narrative, making themselves oftentimes the victim of abuse, which is infuriating. And so every motion that's filed, the attorney on the other side has to rebut it. They have to get the facts in there, because what the predator's doing is they're advancing emotional facts, and so
Mhm.
they're not real. And so how do you combat facts that aren't real? You have corroborating evidence of the real narrative. So I always tell my clients, you have to sort of, you have to get experts, you know, on your side, people that are forensically trained on this kind of psychological personality disorder. You
Mhm.
have to, I mean, it's sort of the same pattern when you're, I've done a lot of trials involving sex abuse, for example, where you bring in a blind expert and the blind expert educates the court on what grooming is. You know, what does that look
Mhm.
like? And why is it so insidious? And why do victims not come forward? And why is there repressive memory and all of those things? And it's very similar in a case of psychological warfare, where you're having to educate the court on, hey, here's my blind expert. Here's what this pathology looks like. And this is what's happening in this case. So that's one aspect. Then you bring in documentation. So lots of exhibits that have corroborating evidence of patterns of behavior. So that if your psychopath is on the stand and, you know, saying something that's completely outrageous and completely wrong, you have the documentation and the corroborating evidence to rebut it. Because that's really what it is. So you're not only presenting an offense, but you're presenting a defense. So it's a very complicated and involved process, but it's necessary in order to be validated and in order to have the paradigm flip in your favor.
Facts are everything here, right? They're that place of, okay, you can say whatever you want to say, but this is a fact. It's got evidence to it. We can back it up. We can push a true narrative. Whereas so often with the psychopath, um, they've thought it through. They haven't totally made it up as they go, but they're really super convincing with this actually happened when it actually didn't. I see judges all the time perplexed, especially new judges, and in jurisdictions where judges change a lot, like they do in California on the family law bench. Um, a lot of judges don't have an opportunity to come to speed
Mhm.
to actually understand what's going on, and by the time they do, they are often rotating out into another field. How, as an attorney, in the early stages, and I want to talk about the early stages because they're the most critical for the clients in setting their pattern and setting their head, having reasonable expectations of how to proceed and not step on the landmines that are being laid for them. Um, how do you get a client in the right mindset. But even more than that, when you walk into a courtroom, before you're at trial, when you're at the early stages of custody fights and that type of stuff, um, how do you approach the judge in terms of lighting the bulb in their head in terms of there's maybe something more afoot here?
Um, yeah, no, that's a good question because you have to do that from day one. And a
Yes.
lot of the what has to happen first of all is that the client has to retain a lawyer who is knowledgeable in this kind of pathology. And a lot of lawyers are not. I mean, they hear the labels sort of bandied about and they a lot of times will glaze over. And I've heard this from clients that the client has to really advocate for themselves. They have to vet that attorney to make sure that attorney understands the paradigm is flipping. This is a predator and they need protection. So that's the first thing. The second thing is um, every time there is a motion filed is an opportunity for the lawyer to educate the court. So even from the very first petition that's filed, petition for dissolution, lay out the facts and lay out and don't label it, but lay out the behavior. So you're setting out your theme, which is you're in a custody battle. Let's just use that as an example. And your client is asking for sole custody. They're asking for it because there's been domestic violence. Maybe there's not recorded domestic violence, which is typically the case. It's usually
Mhm.
psychological. There are not orders of protection. There aren't things that are corroborating this yet. But you're laying the groundwork that this is coming. So what are you doing? You're educating the court on coercive control. You know, are there stalking like behaviors? So that's what you're doing. You're setting it up so that from the very first petition that's filed, you're laying the groundwork. And every petition thereafter, you're going to mention those facts and what that looks like. And as you go through the case, if your case is not going to settle, and here's a news flash, spoiler alert, 90% of these cases do not settle because it's a game and the predator is not interested in resolving the case. They're interested in playing the long game. And that's the sad reality. So that brings me back to your next part of that question, which is managing the client's expectations, right? So not only you're educating the judge on what this looks like, but you're also validating the client and saying, you are not the crazy person. You are living in a crazy world. You're living
Mhm.
in this world that your predator has created for you, and it's not real. And so, what I always try to do is remind them that even from the very beginning of the love bombing and the fairy tale like romance, none of that was real. And so it's a process. And then I try to encourage them to get help on the side, which is the psychologist or the therapist, somebody along the way that's going to be there, that's going to help validate what I'm saying, because
Mhm.
I can't be all things, right?
Right.
But I'm at least validating that.
Mhm.
So and then getting experts lined up. If there are experts, if the case is going to trial, even from the very beginning, saying, a lot of courts want to assign a custody evaluator. It's really important to get the right custody evaluator, somebody who's forensically trained, somebody who's not, no disrespect to social workers, but a lot of
Yep.
them are social workers and they're not skilled in that arena.
Right. And that early vetting when I'm working with a client who may or may not have a um, attorney that really understands these pieces, that they do have to advocate for themselves. They do have to educate themselves about this conversation that we're having right now. They have to have some set of tools to be able to look outside of themselves and see their own participation in it before they can ever start to deconstruct um, the pattern and make some moves. So vetting the attorney, number one, but also I think when working with an attorney, when an attorney is giving them direction or advice, to vet the direction and the advice as they go as well, to really be a part of the game, um, in terms of not abdicating their power and their voice over to that attorney, but being in that dialogue. So the attorney actually understands deeper what their situation is, so they can develop the narrative that that is appropriate here. But also, to your point, Kerrie, this who are the professionals that you're bringing in? Because there's a lot of voices out there, and um, again, to your point, um, therapists aren't always the best voices in the room unless they are deeply, deeply educated about the system and understand what their role is in it. Because sometimes they don't um, execute their role.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and sometimes they don't even really know what their role is.
Yeah. I mean, that's a really good point. And generally, I mean, when I'm talking to a client who is trying to navigate this horribly abusive relationship, oftentimes I'm the first lifeline that they have, because they've been so isolated. They
Mhm.
don't know who to trust. They've been given, to your point, a lot of different information, a lot of advice, and they're just they're in overwhelm mode because
Mhm.
they're not used to advocating for themselves. They're used to being beaten down. And so I think what I do and what I think is really healing and important is I will task them with things to do because it not only empowers them, but it also sort of puts on paper all of the things that they've been experiencing. So in effect, it's a bit of journaling, but it's also a bit of documenting. So I'll say to them, I want you to put down everything with dates, times, specifics, everything that you can remember, first of all, of all of the instances of abuse where you've been yelled at, you've been gaslit, you've been love bombed, whatever they are. So it begins the process of them trying to understand what has happened to them and what that narrative is going to be. Like, where are the strongest pieces of evidence that are going to corroborate the leading narrative we're going to advance? And that's like, step one on that.
Yeah, and it can be really overwhelming to clients when they're given some of that homework, because there can be a lot of stuff that they know is there in terms of text messages or emails,
Mhm.
and to get them to unpack, but not just to unpack it, but to distill it into the most important pieces. So when I'm working with them, when I'm coaching, it's like, okay, that's 10 years ago. That's probably not relevant, but this is 2 years ago. Let's start bringing that stuff forward. Let's start packing this so we can see the patterns going forward. But getting them in a headspace of engagement, I think, is so important, because then they can see, to your point again, Kerrie, that their involvement in it is part of the creation of where they're at. And then for this conversation, disengaging from that behavior and putting themselves in a place to actually get beyond it and survive this stuff in a healthy manner becomes essential for them, because the division in the narrative, I think, is part of the long game,
Mhm.
and the factual representation of that solid narrative is really hard to battle. As an attorney that is working with these clients like yourself, that preparation makes your job so much easier.
Yes. Yes, it does. I mean, that engagement, I think, is absolutely critical for the litigation, because you're right. I mean, I think many have been in a place where they've been a spectator in a lot of sense. I mean, they're a spectator in their own life
Mhm.
because they've been so controlled. They're with somebody who has controlled every aspect of them and made them believe that every time they assert themselves, whatever they have to say, their voice is meaningless. And that's the challenge, is to sort of not only reconstruct that, but convince them that we have to change that paradigm. We have to validate them and make them understand that they didn't cause this abuse, but they have to start advocating for themselves. They have
Hmm.
to start speaking, right? They have to like reclaim that voice that has been silenced. And so that's the powerful part of it. And I think as the litigation goes forward, as long as you can maintain that and keep them recording and documenting, they start to see the mountain of evidence, and
Hmm.
what is, they start to parse the difference between what is real and what isn't real. And that's a pretty interesting and exciting evolution to be a part of, where you start to see that. Because by the time they get into the courtroom, they're pretty empowered.
Hmm. So I would even go a step further in terms of the parsing as they're working through it to get to not what you just said, but to not just what's real, but also what's important and what's not important in that narrative as well. Because this is such a highly, when they start to unpack and really come into the notion of what's happened to them, what's happening to them, and the chaos that comes with that, that can be overwhelming. And there's this mushroom of, well, there was this, there was this, there was this, there was this, there was this. And we don't want to send in 150 pages in a declaration, not only because it's not allowed, but it's not going to be looked at. So, what becomes the important conversations in all of that mass of now memories and stuff that they're starting to log down? How do you get them to come into focus with that?
So there's two ways of doing that. I mean, I sort of, I start with a technique that you described earlier, which is don't give me the past, don't give me the history, don't give me the 10 years or however long it's been that you've been abused, because I get it. I know it's been going on for a long time, and here we are. So give me the last 6 months. I start with 6 months. Usually there's a ton of stuff on a daily basis. So I say, give me the last 6 months, because we want to bring current examples of certain behaviors. And so I will ask them, what are the behaviors that have impacted you the most? And so if they say, well, I don't like, the way he's been so controlling, I'll say, well, how is this going to translate in terms of what the court is interested in? And so in Arizona, where I practice, it's the best interest of the children. It
Hmm.
probably is that way
Yep.
nationwide, but that's really the number one thing the court is concerned about. So how are these behaviors impacting his ability to be a parent to these children? So I will reframe whatever the thing is. So if the client says he's really controlling, he locks me in a closet for a weekend, so I can take that incident and say, okay, well, how many times has he done that? And then the person will say, well, it seems to be on a regular basis. And then I'll rework that into, okay, how do you think that would play to a judge if you say, if you're unavailable, locked in a closet, is this in front of your children? Where are your children when this is happening? Okay, so that's one way of reframing whatever horrible thing has happened. So I'm always bringing it back to how is it impacting the children? Because the ultimate goal in a lot of those cases is to be able to say to the court, look, this person is not a good influence on the kids. He's never available. Okay, so then you can go for neglect or abuse. You can say he's never available. His work hours are erratic. He's fraternizing with prostitutes or wherever it is that you can prove. And now you're going to convince the judge that the lifestyle that he has is negatively going to impact the kids. So therefore, he's dangerous to the children. We want to protect the children. If the court says, well, we always start with the premise or the presumption that joint decision making should be the norm, right? It should be equal parenting time, joint decision making, but predator hasn't seen his children in 3 months and always leaves them with a third party. Well, now you're going to start framing that narrative with a court saying, well, maybe he shouldn't be reunited.
Mhm.
Maybe there's a reason he's leaving them with third party. And who is this third party? And, should we trust that third party? So based on what the client gives me in those 6 months is how I frame whatever the narrative is going to be. Because I start to see, as I tell the client, all we need to do is convince the judge that this person is not a good parent. Like, you cannot co-parent with this person. Or if you're going to have to co-parent, do we need supervised visitation? What is going on in this person's pattern of behavior that is negatively impacting the children? And so that's how I start to frame whatever that story is going to be to the court.
So the courts are really reluctant to pull children away from any parent. It takes a lot to get to that piece. And in this arena of what is too much, what is not enough in terms of parenting time, how do we take that best interest conversation, if you will, and say, well, is it in the best interest of this child not to have a relationship with this person, which is really rare. I mean, you've seen,
It's very rare.
yeah, very, very frequently does that happen. But what are the break points that are important to put out there and start to coalesce a narrative around about restricted um, decision making, or legal custody versus um, not having a voice in the decision making for education or health or whatever? Where do you start to really lean into getting somebody to pay attention to this person is creating a narrative that isn't accurate, because oftentimes these people, as they enter into the separation or start the divorce, they're really good at masking their behavior, of coming to speed, of showing up, of I've got flexible hours now and I can show up and I can do this. I've changed my schedule, because two things can be true. One, I've had very healthy parents make those shifts
Mhm.
because they see the importance of it. And there's this benefit of the doubt that goes along with the judge in watching that behavior. Okay, that was then, but this is now, right? And the other side of that conversation, where it's just a game, and as soon as the eyes are off, that the behavior is going to go back to what it was.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very difficult task for a judge to be able to differentiate between, what is manipulative behavior and what is authentic. And
Mhm.
so again, I think that's where the patterns are really important. So if you start with the 6 months and you see all of a sudden, the predator is now going to all of the games, um, showing up at the school for lunch hour, volunteering in the classroom, like doing all these things. Now I say, well, let's expand that a little bit. What has changed in the last, I don't know, month before litigation that Predator is now doing all these things? What has changed? And so if there isn't anything, like there isn't a job change or, anything other than a filing of the lawsuit, we want to highlight that, right? That's
Mhm.
the line in the sand where suddenly now he's the good psychopath. Okay. So then we can go even farther and say, okay, show me patterns of this over the last year. Okay. So what are school events that he missed? What is his travel schedule? How often was he home? And what do we have that corroborates this? And I task people, I say, find your social media profiles. Some of them
Mhm.
have it, some of them don't. But what's being documented on social media? Is he out in Las Vegas when this major event happens? Is he out drinking with buddies when this thing happens? So that's when we open it up and give them a theme and a topic to go back and dig through things. And
Mhm.
oftentimes people have not recorded anything, or they think they haven't. And I'll say, go back to text messages, go back to emails, go
Mhm.
back to social media, go back to a school calendar, go back to something, and go back to a possible witness. So I'll tell people, task or find allies in the school system that can help support some of this. A lot of teachers in parent teacher conference schedules, for example, will have a sign in sheet. Who's the person that signed in? They'll have a coach. Like, who's the person that shows up at the games? So those are some of the things that we'll start digging for, because you're right. It's a monumental task, and it's incredibly important to establish this sort of line in the sand for the judge, because you're right. All of a sudden, predator is looking like golden child, in front of the court, and we have to dispel that. And that's the really difficult part.
So tell me about your book, Surviving the
So,
Psychopath.
my book is called Surviving a Psychopath in Court, in Life, and in Love, with air quotes. And it takes you through not only identifying what the particular traits of psychopathy are, but it gives you, all kinds of examples of who these people are, how they show up, and how ordinary, empathetic people are going to be sucked into their world. And it's a way that it's not only a book that identifies and makes you aware of it, but it's also a book that gives you um, real guidepost on what do you do, like real steps. How do you document things? And it gives you examples. How do you know if you're in a relationship with a predator? And you have quizzes in the book where you can take them through all of the traits and say, okay, it's a check. And I think it's really important to identify who they are, because that helps in identifying the behaviors and the patterns that you're trying to avoid and trying to escape from. And so it takes you through, what does it look like when the school gets involved? How can they be helpers? How can they be inhibitors? There's all kinds of things that happen in the school system that need to be addressed. And then it takes you into, what does that look like in the courtroom if you wind up in a battle with one? What do you have to do? Like, how do you vet your attorney? How do you get your experts on your side? How do you make the judge aware? And how do you escape? And so it's full of stories that are composites of real life cases. And it's also peppered with real life cases of people that have encountered predators like this, how they've survived it, and how they have thrived it. And so that's really the message behind the book, is let's get you empowered and emboldened, and get you beyond survival to thrival.
Mm-hmm.
How do you recover from that? Because it is recovery. I mean, it takes a long time. Not only are you getting divorced, but you're literally starting to rethink your own life, and how you showed up in that partnership, and how to avoid it so you don't repeat it.
One of the problems that happens, um, when we start to make these shifts, when our clients start to make these shifts, um, things don't always go well. They often get worse because the patterns are changing. This is a control piece for the person with the psychopathy. And when they're threatened with losing control, they start to shapeshift. They start to try to find different ways to maintain that control. And oftentimes that's an escalation, which is something that have been people that have been involved with these personalities are pretty afraid of that escalation, because the intimidation, the psychological intimidation, the physical threat, even if it's not ever executed, but that big energy, I'm going to destroy you kind of a energy that comes along with it, because that's certainly what's behind it. It's I'm going to do whatever it takes to destroy you. And when that person starts to show up with those boundaries, which they're not very good at to begin with, things start to go awry. And how do you hold that client in tow so they don't slip off into the ionosphere and disappear into space?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very real possibility in these kinds of cases. And so I think it's really important to have a strategy going in, to be able to be very straightforward with the client and say, here's the escalation, here's the possibility of what could happen.
Mhm.
Because you're right. I mean, once they feel like they're losing control or they're being demasked, right? Their
Yes.
mask is coming off. Um, they're starting. They don't know how to navigate that, because remember, they're mimicking and imitating you,
Mhm.
and they have gotten to you because you have somehow revealed a vulnerability to them. And so that's what they prey on. They prey on that vulnerability and they show up for exactly what you need at the time. And so the more that the client becomes empowered and emboldened and finds their voice, the more threatened that psychopath is going to be. And so they are then going to escalate their behaviors. And oftentimes we see that manifesting as stalking, it's manifesting as violence. Sometimes it manifests as financial abuse, where
Mhm.
they're going to destroy the person by just completely depleting all accounts and draining assets, destroying professions, a reputation. I mean, there are any number of ways that a predator can retaliate and lash out. And so, again, that becomes part of the strategy of a litigation. But it also means that the client has to now start taking proactive steps. So, does that mean orders of protection? Does that mean documenting every possible stalking incident to the police? Again, it's part of recording and part of documenting, making sure that you're not the only eyes on this, that there are now other people involved, other, investigative eyes on this particular pathology. So it's really important to start engaging other people in it. And so, and that's what I tell them. I said, you have to get strategic about it. You have to know what leverage you have over this predator. What is the one thing that they don't want exposed or revealed? And sometimes that's really hard to find because they don't
Mhm.
care. They have
Sure.
no guilt, remorse, or shame. So it's very hard to find out what is actually going to trigger them. The one thing I tell people is, if you change the paradigm of how you react to them and you respond to them, you're not giving them fuel anymore. So
Mhm.
you're becoming less interesting to the predator. And that's a real thing. The less interesting you are to them, the more they're likely to start moving away from that, because they're not getting the same fuel, the same stimulation. And so you're basically trying to diffuse. So you're engaging outside forces by
Mhm.
contacting law enforcement, but you're also diffusing their interest in you. And so those are the two things that I employ pretty pretty well off the bat.
So disengagement from them,
Yes.
um, taking the food away, and internally disengaging from the reactivity. And I think the nervous system piece is a really important conversation here, because without that, the continued anxiety and enmeshment in the fight is problematic. It's hard to break. And the engagement in the process of fact gathering, the engagement of establishing the patterns, of getting law enforcement involved, and doing those pieces are two of the same to me. The disengagement over here is what we want to be doing, and we want to be self motivated in the taking on the tasks that are needed, because your attorney's not going to do that. They've got other things to do, and their job is to get the narrative down, to put the pieces in front of the judge, to argue the case. But it gets very expensive and non-productive if you're looking for your attorney to do that work for you, right?
Right. It is. And it's hard to say to a client, because this is what I want to say, but I also understand the reality and how expensive it is. But what I would want to say to the client is, go radio silent,
Mhm.
disengage completely.
Yes.
Don't text them, don't react. If you need to respond to them, make sure that it's literally less than 3 sentences,
Mhm.
and that it's completely focused on whatever the subject is supposed to be. So if
Right.
it's about custody, make it focused on the children, because what they will receive is a long diatribe, sometimes 3 pages long, and maybe somewhere sandwiched on page 2 in the middle
Mhm.
of the page is the actual subject of what they want to engage you about.
Right.
So you're having to waste so much energy and time having not only to read that, dribble, but also to respond to it. And so the very first thing that a client who's used to this sort of dynamic is going to do is react to everything that is in that three
Mhm.
page diatribe, right? And that's a huge waste of time and energy. And it doesn't move the needle forward on how they're going to get away from this person eventually. So it is sort of a re educating and re skilling this person to be able to distill from those 3 pages these 3 sentences. But ideally, there should be no communication unless they absolutely have to, shoot a text message saying, okay, here's where the kids are going to be today. So part of what goes into that is having a judge who writes very, very clear, unambiguous court orders, right? So if there's parenting time, if there's, telephone contact, make sure it is absolutely 100% rock solid, no interpretation, because that way the client doesn't have to communicate at all with the psychopath. It is in the
Mhm.
court order. So that ideally is what we want. But you're
So,
right. I mean, to be able to say to the client, just have them communicate through your lawyer is really expensive, and it doesn't ultimately help the client.
and this is where the parallel parenting model starts to come into play, where those orders are super clear that each parent is disengaged from them. This ongoing back and forth, which always ends up in an argument, not a solution, gets eliminated. And you're talking about this level of not communicating with the other client or with the other parent. Um, just to clarify a little bit, in my experience, that's not gray rocking. Gray rocking is kind of sticking your head in the sand and not processing what's going on. The disengagement piece that I think you're talking about is an integrative, okay, this is coming at me. I have a skill set now that I can parse out that this is not important and this isn't about me. It's about the cycle, it's about the game. So the disengagement becomes I'm going to remove myself from that and I'm going to focus on what is important for this child, where I show up for that, where I put the phraseology in the parenting plan that addresses exactly what needs to happen with that, where I can make an argument for decision making in a particular area because of this patterning of um, getting involved with therapists and doctors in a negative fashion that does not um, give the kids what their needs are, and to be able to bring forth that best interest conversation so somebody can see it bright and clear. And that requires, I think, Kerrie, a level of engagement in, oh, that's the spec I need to pull out. That's the piece I need to respond to. And all of this stuff is just hook. It's just they're trolling to try to get me into the chaos again. Yeah, that's the masterfulness of the psychopath piece, but it's also the simplicity, I think, of being able to derail them.
Yes. Yes. Bingo. That's it. That's it. Exactly. Yeah. And I think it's really important, just to add to that, that it's not something that anybody can do for the client.
No.
They have to do it themselves, because you're right. That is the piece that enables them to move beyond that.
Yeah.
Because if you have children together, as you pointed out, it's very, very rare that a court is going, without physical abuse, is
Mm-hmm.
going to completely remove the predator from the children's lives.
Yeah.
So the goal is to minimize the damage, or attempt to. And part of that is making sure that the client is strong and resilient and is not going to repeat this, and learns how to communicate with a dangerous, toxic person.
So here's the hook, I think, for so many of our clients. Um, they think that they can do it by themselves. They think that they can read a book, listen to a podcast, um, take information from friends and figure this out on their own. And I don't think they can. I think that, there are those of us in the field that have the knowledge, that have the expertise, and the ability to guide in an efficient manner to get them to break these patterns. But so much of them are hidden, they're internal, they're family of origin stuff. And for me, I'm not a therapist, I'm a coach. And I'm not going to try to fix the past piece, but I'm going to use that to bring it forward so they can see the patterning. And then to set in place the strategic movements to get them to disengage, to move in the directions that are efficient for them, that don't keep them in this deep throes of this mess for years. I think that they're going to be in the throes of this for years regardless. But how they learn how to navigate it and to kind of just take it as it comes and dismiss it and move forward in their lives is important, and it's available to almost everybody in this process. But it's not a it's a participation sport. This is not something that you're going to observe and learn. You've got to actually get engaged with it. And I find that because of financial restrictions or time restrictions or the perception of those being restrictions, that people go into overwhelm and freeze and get stuck in this for sometimes decades.
Yeah, years.
So you writing a book about this is so important because there's a light here. There's the bulb that goes on. It's like, okay, I can see this. This is what I'm in. And then to begin to work that. But I think in working through those pieces, there has to be somebody on the other end of this that's giving them reflection, that's helping them to dial this in and get precise with the nuance that goes on with this, because it's not a blanket story. It's not a complicated story. It's not something that is complicated to work through, but it's nuanced. And without that reflection, I think people run into a lot of trouble.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think it's really important for people to understand that it is a process. It's really like, call it, it's recovery. It's
Mm-hmm.
just recovery in a different way. It's a
Right.
trauma recovery, and you can't expect to, um, you know, it to be sort of a 24-hour thing. It's the first part of any recovery is when you hit rock bottom, and then you make an awareness and you have an epiphany and you're like, oh my gosh, that, because you have to want to change, and you have to want to get better and recognize that what you have gone through is a psychological battle. You've been psychologically wounded, and that it's a soul wound, and it goes very deep. And I think that there are definitely mechanisms that help people to recover from that, but I think they have to understand it is a long road to recovery.
Mm-hmm.
And what I have seen, I'm sure you have too, is this sort of repetitive cycle, where they will get out of divorce and immediately be in another relationship before they've had a chance to heal, before they've really done the deep dive and are in recovery, so to speak. And so it just repeats this cycle of it, because oftentimes people will go back to what they're familiar with,
Mm-hmm.
what they're comfortable with, and they're like it or not, they're used to that dynamic of being controlled, and this sort of, you know, um, perverse notion that every relationship is transactional. So I think it's definitely, you have to want to do the work. And I think by the time somebody gets to divorce, especially if they're initiating it, they're at a point where they want to do the work. They
Right.
want to get out of this horrific situation and actually live a life.
And model for their children a way to be in life that doesn't replicate this. That,
Yes.
through their empowerment, through their um, hopefully new parenting style, their choice of who they bring into their world, not necessarily as a partner, but as a rule, who they associate with, and how they associate with them becomes a really growthful piece that they get to actually work the problem and see the change in it.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. I always like to say to people, do you want to be a ghost in your own life, or do you want to be where your feet are? Do you want to be present?
right.
So,
So, Kerrie, thanks for bringing this in and joining me today on this podcast. How can our listeners find your book? How can they hire you as an attorney? How can they get in touch with
yeah.
you?
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's such an important conversation. My book, Surviving a Psychopath, is available on Amazon and anywhere books are sold under my name, Kerrie Droban. My practice is Zhivago Law, so they can find me on my website, zhivagolaw.com, hire me as a consultant, or if you're in Arizona, for family law.
And hiring you as a consultant, what does that look like?
Consultant means I become like the expert witness in your case. So I help clients strategize. I work with their attorney to navigate the best strategy, the best documentation, what's the roadmap as you litigate it.
Awesome. Awesome. Again, thank you for coming in, everybody. This has been a rich, rich conversation again. I hope to have you back at some date. And everybody keep listening. Take care. Kerrie, stay here.